Zoom. There we go. All right. So today's training is a training I've done before. I've updated it, and we've had quite a few new people join since I think when I last did this. It's a topic that is relevant. I think all of you, or at least those managing projects, are dealing with managing change on a daily basis, as it should be. And it's something that if it's not managed can really turn into a nightmare. And the objective of today's presentation is really to focus on identifying change and clearly managing it, and some of the tools that we use to help so that it doesn't become a contentious topic with our clients. So I'll start off with what is scope. And scope is defined by a set of clearly defined requirements associated design elements. It could be the scope as defined in a statement of work for a project. It could be the scope defined by a single task to, for example, to update checkout. But it should have a set of clearly defined requirements that, of course, you've collaborated on with the client, and any associated design elements, mock-ups, documentation, anything that's going to help the developer, and more importantly, to help you to manage expectations as well as what we are going to be delivering as part of this project. The scope should be clear, coherent, and concrete. If you think of the scope as a contract, it should have enough clarity that the client understands what they're getting. It should be clear and easy to read, and concrete. Eliminate any ambiguity. If there's ambiguity, ask the questions to document it and drive out that ambiguity. What the scope is not is it's not the customer's ideal state or intended outcome. If the scope is not well defined, you get into this situation where you're now trying to build something to align with the customer's ideal state or what they intended. It wasn't clear, it wasn't concrete, it wasn't coherent, and you're in this fluid, ambiguous, a scope that is very difficult to manage, and it becomes contentious because things weren't clear. Client had one thing in mind and you had another thing in mind. So very important to ensure that you ask all of the right questions, you understand what the customer's ideal state and intended outcome is from the beginning, because if it's not documented, that's not the scope. The scope is what is written down clearly, coherently, and concretely. Any questions so far?
No.
Okay. Change in any project is a reality that is likely to come up at one point or another. Every client has changes. Our clients, if we're doing our job, are learning more about Magento, its capabilities, its limitations, and in many ways, we're inspiring our clients. We're teaching them about capabilities or features of Magento that they didn't even know existed. And they're thinking about, how does that apply to my business? And that's inspiration that can result in new requirements, new solutions that we're building for the client or adding to the project for the client. And at the same time, we're learning more about the client, their business, their processes, their products, their customers, and ultimately their requirements and objectives. All of that is happening through engagement, and we're likely to come up with things that never came out during the sales process or never came up during those initial meetings where we were defining the scope. As we learn more about their business, we're going to be able to propose more things. Doesn't mean they need to do it, but we're going to learn more about their business where we can be a better and better consultant to them. Both of these lead to change. They lead to us making recommendations. It leads to the client being inspired and wanting to do more. So change is not a bad thing. In both of these cases, it's resulting in positive outcomes for them. If we inspire them and something resonates and aligns with their business model and they think it can help them, that's positive. If we learn more about their business and can be a better consultant and make more recommendations and suggestions, that helps them. So change is a reality in any project. It's going to occur. So the key is managing the change. Projects are completed by people. People have new ideas. They recognize mistakes and change their minds. Every one of us have had a client that changes their mind about a requirement. Hopefully it's at the beginning when you're discussing, here's how it's going to work. And they're like, wait a minute, I actually prefer to work this way. But sometimes they change their mind at the end and they're testing it and they realize there's something that they would like for it to do differently. All of these are examples of change that we may encounter. So it's important to recognize, accept, and prepare for the possibility of change. Don't look at it as a negative. Look at it as a positive, but also understand that and help your clients to understand, set expectations with them that change is going to occur. We'll talk about it. We'll provide alternatives. We will decide to put it off till later, or we may decide to squeeze it into the project now. But change is should be treated as something positive. Now, it's not always a positive, and it ultimately comes down to how it's managed. Already had to get a drink of water. So change could be a great opportunity, as I mentioned, for both the client and for Crimson Agility. Or it could be project manager's worst nightmare. And that's really going to only happen if it's not identified and managed effectively. Excuse me. So some of the reasons for change that we encounter, we talked about being inspired and we talked about us learning more about the business. But what does that translate into? It translates into new or changed requirements. But we can also encounter change due to unanticipated complexity or risk. I think every one of you can think of a project where product data resulted in some unanticipated complexity, something that we didn't count on, something that was not baked into our process or our methodology. Ambiguity in requirements. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, the requirements are ambiguous. Maybe to us, we made assumptions that that weren't well documented. Maybe the client gave us the requirements at too high a level. And so there could be ambiguity in the requirements. Client changed their mind or missed requirements. It's a myth for us to think about all of those are our fault, or these are all negative, and that we're going to have to take it on the chin for these. We need to ensure that accountability goes both ways. There are times where, there are times where we do need to be accountable, but also the client needs to be accountable. They have to understand that the statement of work is the documentation that we work from, and that ultimately we're going to go back to assess what's in scope and what's not in scope. So the success of the project may require course correction and change. I could also add to that, the success of the project, first of all, requires setting clear expectations. It may require course correction, especially during the design and planning phase of a project, and ultimately a change request. Any questions on any of that? Okay, so let's talk about some of the common errors. And I jest here, but I put here, you might be a redneck if anyone in your family ever died right after saying, "Hey, watch this," or I've also heard here, "Hold my beer and watch this." But in project management, some of the things that we do or assume are kind of that same caliber. You know, they're going to end badly, and it's a common assumption that we say we can absorb these changes over the course of the project. Maybe there was a requirement, client wanted something much more elegant than what we had scoped, and to avoid the difficult conversation, we assume, okay, we're going to do it, we'll find a way to absorb it over the course of the project. Never works out. The next one is we'll make up the time on something else. I'm going to steal project management time. I'm going to steal QA time. We're going to, borrow some time from another part of the project to do this. As I mentioned on the prior side, it's our fault. The statement of work is a result of several conversations, us documenting what we've heard, the client reviewing it with the client, giving the client the opportunity for feedback, inputs, creating clarity, and ultimately the document's a document that both parties are accountable for, both parties are bound by. And though there may be some things that are ambiguous in there, we'll talk about some techniques to ensure that those don't become a problem within the context of the project. Another misnomer is, since we talked about it, it is in scope. Clients in many cases have bad memories. They feel like, well, we talked about this during the sales process, but they forget that they jettisoned it or threw it overboard because they wanted to manage costs. Or we talked about it, but it wasn't clear to us that that was a requirement. So if it's not in the statement of work, it's not in the scope. We also sometimes avoid the difficult conversations. We put off creating the project status report. Or the last one is, this change is too small to require a change order, right? There's a small, maybe they just want to install a third-party extension. I'm not proposing that we create a change request or a change order for a third-party extension, you know, for 2-3 hours, whatever that's going to take. But to not call it out as out of scope and not highlight it in a project status report as something that we may add to a future change request could be a mistake. You know, it's very easy to die the death of 1,000 cuts if you start to ignore or sweep these little changes under the rug. Any other common errors that anybody's fallen prey to or has encountered? Okay. So those were some of the common errors we make. What are some of the top reasons for overages? Where overages are really where change is out of control. So first of all, poor assumptions. If we go into a project and we've made assumptions and those assumptions don't come to fruition or are not in fact true, that could result in a lot more work than we expected. Poor estimating, trying to force fit an estimate because we're afraid the client is going to object to a higher estimate. So we need to be very careful about our estimating. Requirements are too high level, too ambiguous. You can also manage tasks at too high a level, and it creates risks because you really don't know where the developer is in the process. If you don't have checkpoints, if you can't break it down into manageable subtasks. Poor project management and oversight. It's very common during remediation of UAT issues for things to get out of control. Lack of clearly defined methodology on projects, not so much on managed services, but on projects. Everything should have a methodology associated with it. When you go into the data, and Anais and I just got off a call for a new project that she's starting. Part of it is defining, we had 40 hours allocated for data. Well, how does that 40 hours break down? Well, the first 10 hours of it is gaining access to their data, extracting it, doing some analysis of it, modeling it within the Magento instance for them, and then reviewing a clearly defined strategy and plan for the data that they sign on to. If we can't do that within the first 10 hours, which is allocated for that part of the methodology as it relates to data, then we need to ask for more time. Maybe it took us more time to get access to their data. Maybe it took more time to extract it than we thought. But that part of the methodology as it relates to the data migration needs to be well managed. If we say we have 40 and it takes us 20 to do that first part, we're gonna always be running behind. And then later in the project, we're going to be looking for more time to complete the data. So some of the areas where there should be a clearly defined methodology are on data. Here's, the 40 hours, here's how we're going to use that. Here's what we need you to do. Here's what you're responsible for. Here's what we're responsible for. And make sure that the client has, clear expectations as it relates to the data. The same is true of validation and deployment. What is our expectation? How many deployments are we going to do? What does the UAT and remediation process look like? What is how much time is allocated to the go live checklist and the day of go live? Make sure that that's well defined, and that way deviations can be pointed out as requiring additional time in many cases. Poor task management, lack of accountability. This could be both from the client and on our part, sloppy work and not managing the change. So not managing the change as it relates to the reasons for overages it could be one of the biggest culprits. And it goes back to all of these common errors. It's our fault. We can absorb the change over the course of the project. We'll make it up somewhere. All of those things can result in significant overages or non-billable time on a project. So setting expectations starts with the statement of work, right? The client should understand right from the get-go, we're kicking off the project. The statement of work is kind of our gold standard for the scope, the budget, the timeline. We're going to measure against the statement of work for completeness, for where we are as it relates to the budget, where we are as it relates to the timeline. The client should plan for 10 to 20% contingency. I think most of the smart ones do. They understand that a project like this, they understand there is going to be change. There are going to be things that they want to do that they never thought of before. There are going to be things that we come back and tell them are more complex. And so most larger, more mature clients will plan some form of contingency. If you make the assumption it's there, it makes it a little easier to have that conversation. But in our project kickoff meeting, we tell them there's likely to be change. Starting with clearly defined requirements, we do a design and planning phase of the project. It should be within the first few weeks. Anais and I are going into this new project telling them this project has a 10-week timeline. If you want to stick to that 10-week timeline, within the first 2 weeks, we need to complete this. Let's schedule the meetings. Let's get this done and make sure that we can complete everything that we need to within the first 2 weeks. Not always possible. I know Patty's dealing with a client that is just not completing their action items. They're not making the decisions. They're not providing the inputs that we need. And so that first 2 to 3 weeks is dragging on. But we've already told them through project status reports that the project's now delayed because we didn't complete this design and planning phase of the project as planned. So this is where joint accountability comes in. If we set expectations, if they know what they'll be required to provide, what they'll be required to do, what decisions we're going to need them to make as quickly or as early in the project as possible, then we can hold them accountable for those later in the project. I always say, I suggest that every meeting, weekly update meeting, you follow up with a meeting summary, you make sure it's clear what their expectations are. I always like to set up a communications log in Smartsheets where you can track open items, action items, decisions that need to be made. Anything that you want to assign to the client, you can put things that you've assigned to yourself in there as well. But that creates joint accountability. It ensures that they can see the items that are now creating risk because they haven't responded to. So the later a change is addressed, whether it's in a project status report or a change request, the greater the risk to the time and budget. if you're doing a project status report, my guidelines are every three weeks, could go 4 weeks, depending on the level of activity or the decisions that have been made or what there is to report. But I think every 3 weeks is a good rule of thumb. You want to address the change in a meeting summary right after a meeting, right after a decision was made or a change was identified. Get it in the meeting summary, get it in a project status report. And if it's material enough, get a change request in their hands as soon as possible. And make sure that everybody's in agreement before we do it. The hardest change to manage and hold the client accountable for is change that is brought to their attention at the end of the project, when you realize you're out of time, when you realize you weren't able to absorb it, and you're now scrambling to get a change request so that we can get the project completed. So this is why you don't let it linger or go unaddressed, and save it till the end, because you lose credibility when you're running out of time and money and now you're asking for more. You have a lot of credibility if you can address it in the design and planning phase of the project in those first 2 or 3 weeks. Okay, so what are change requests? This is one of the tools that we use to manage change. It should provide a clear description of the change, the reason for the change in scope. So define it as, as if it were a statement of work, as if it were a legally binding contract of what we're going to do. You want to document that change. What is the impact on the timeline? Sometimes it's only an impact on budget. Sometimes it's an impact on time and budget. But outline or document the impact on time and budget. You can group a bunch of changes together. We recently did a change order for Frontier that included several changed or new requirements. It also included additional PM and QA time, as well as additional overhead time. So it could include several items. It doesn't have to be item by item. And provide options, right? Proceed with the change, might cost money, exchange for lesser requirements, trade-off, right? We're cutting this out, we're adding this in. Document that, because the things that you're cutting out, you don't want them to ask for them later, and it wasn't clear, it was maybe said in passing in a meeting. Make sure that anything that is traded out for something else is documented. You can push it to a later phase. It's still going to cost them money, but let's get the site launched. Sometimes it's better to do that than impact the timeline or to impact the budget. Doing it at a later phase, it can roll over into ad hoc services or a managed services plan. And I like to propose I call it a fast follow. We're going to launch without it. Within the first 2 or 3 weeks of the site being launched, we'll complete these fast follow items and get them done under your managed services contract. Do nothing. It's an option. It's kind of like the take it or leave it option. You wanted to do this. This is what it's going to cost. Alternatively, we don't have to do this, put it on the backlog. So offer options. If you've already done the work, if you burned through the hours and, again, you're taking all of the options off the table for the client. It's not a best practice. It's actually a failure of scope management or change management, is when you come in and you say, this took us longer than we expected, right? Now you're coming in after the fact, the work's been done. Client doesn't have options to do nothing. They don't have options with proceed, exchanging out other requirements. Well, I guess they could, but it really takes the options away. And ultimately you're just telling them, we burned through all of the money. We need more money. Okay, so some of the best practices at a tactical level, make sure that you have discrete design elements. The statement of work is great. It provides a high level overview of the functionality that we're building or the work that we're doing. But during the design and planning process, try to be more specific. Try to ensure that they feel like they're on the same page with you. Make sure you walk them through that functionality. Outline a use case. Say, here's how a typical client will interact with this, and make sure we're not missing anything. Excuse me just a second. Okay. Identify challenges. Look at the statement of work. Identify what areas you think are going to be the most risky, which are challenging to estimate. Maybe the developers are telling you they have medium confidence in estimating a task. Excuse me. Identify those early, address them early, look for ways to simplify if you can, look for ways to maybe introduce a change request. But identify those challenge areas early, get started on them, because those are likely the areas that are going to pose project risk. Ensure there's a clear approach with proven feasibility when preparing estimates. If the approach is not well defined, find out what we need to better define it. Do we need more time for the estimate? Do we need some time for research? Find out what's needed to have high confidence in the approach and the estimate that we're providing. Sometimes it's not possible. I've pressed, Ian and Ryan on tasks that they found very difficult to estimate. And when there truly is no way to estimate it without doing it, in those cases, you buffer it. You set expectations that, hey, this is our best guess on this. There are elements of this that we just won't know until we get into it. We're telling you that now. And once we get into it, we'll let you know if we're going to need more time or if we've allocated enough time. Set their expectations that there's the possibility of change or recalibrating our estimates on a task. There's nothing wrong with that. Particularly on a project, on an upgrade. You can, when you're estimating the upgrade, say there's some area here of risk and of concern. It's really difficult for us to estimate this without spending a bunch of time estimating it. So we'd much rather come back to you and let you know, if it's going to be the best case scenario, the worst case scenario, or the likely scenario. Communicate that in advance. It's not what clients like to hear, but at least you're being upfront and honest with them. Drive out ambiguity. ensure that that you're asking all of the right questions to ensure that a task is well defined. Manage your risk areas, know where they are and manage them closely. Communicate with your clients, with your developers, ensure that everything that you need to be successful is available to you. At a strategic level, so that was tactical, day-to-day. At a strategic level, statement of work, review it with the client during the design and planning phase, make sure they understand each part of the statement of work. Anais and I just talked about this new project. We're going to review with the client what we've outlined in the statement of work as it relates to data, make sure that they understand that the first 10 hours is gaining access, extracting the data, doing some data analysis and modeling it. If we can't complete that within 10 hours, we're going to go back and ask them for more time, because the other, we can't use the other time that's allocated to customers and order data and product catalog data. We'll just be setting ourselves up for failure. Identify the risk early in the project, manage those areas more closely. Every minute of time that you spend at the beginning of the project in that design and planning phase will pay dividends if you approach it methodically and carefully and ensure that requirements are agreed upon. Recalibrate early. As I mentioned, the earlier you can introduce, you can communicate change or identify it, communicate it, manage it, the more credibility that you'll have. Project status reports are no more than a tool to manage accountability, manage change, demonstrate progress. It's a formal communication tool, and I always say it creates joint accountability. It creates ownership that the client has to adhere to, right? And if you have project status reports throughout the project, you can go back and point to things you've communicated or highlighted and that they agreed to and signed off on early in the project that might come up at the end of the project. So doing those about every 3 weeks, I think creates the right rhythm in terms of accountability and helps to manage expectations and change. So tools for managing change, have clearly defined plan and strategy for things like mock-ups, data, UAT. These are 3 areas that if you don't outline what the plan is to the client for mock-ups, right? The plan is to meet, we're going to cover these pages, we're going to create some annotated screenshots, or we're going to take some notes, we're going to get them to our graphic designer, they're going to come back with some mock-ups, we're going to review those with you, incorporate your feedback and your inputs into those mock-ups. That is a plan. And we're going to go through 3 iterations where you have the opportunity to provide feedback and input and influence. After that 3rd iteration, now, okay, why so many iterations? Did they completely change their mind from the first one? Well, we should request more time. We should do a change request for that. So have a clearly defined plan and strategy that goes along with mock-ups, especially data and UAT. Go into UAT with a plan. This is the plan. This is the process. And in order for us to effectively manage it, we need you to do this, and then we'll do that, right? If you go into it with a plan, So it's not chaotic, it's not piecemeal, that they have their responsibilities, we have ours. Then again, there's joint accountability. They're accountable for their parts, we're accountable for ours, for all this to work as it was designed in the statement of work. So have a plan, have a strategy that you review with the client prior to these activities. Use the communication log along with meeting summaries. The communications logs create action items, they create dependencies, give the client access to them so that they can make sure you review all the open items on every call. This creates joint accountability. And in many cases, we're delayed because of client missing deadlines on action items that we had for them, requests or decisions that we had from them. The project is delayed. They forget all about that when the project's late and their boss is hammering them for the project being late. Project status reports, as we mentioned, I included a link to an example here of a well-written project status report and also to a change request. So there are links to examples here that you can use to effectively use those tools for managing change. That's it. Any questions or comments? Very interested in anyone's thoughts or any experiences that they'd like to share.
Just that it's very different on a customer by customer basis.
Yeah, it's I mean, excellent point. Know your customer, right? If you're working with I don't know, a client like High Speed Gear, typically pretty reasonable. If you're going to go a little over on a task, it's probably not a big deal. You know, put some justification in there. The clients, you know, if you know Bobby over there, you know, he's likely going to approve it. But if you're working with Van Horn Truck Parts, know that they are going to hold your feet to the fire. And so you better request any additional time that's needed in advance and early. And it better be well defined, because then you have the picky clients, right? That you know, they pick on every little, you know, they wanted it was their vision in their mind that was never documented that they're measuring everything against. And you have to remind them that, you know, we built what was documented here and what you approved. So yeah, good point, Adam. Know your client and know who you're dealing with and how they're going to respond to change.
I have a question. Just with like how you approach the conversation with change. I know we talked about it a little bit, but like, is there examples of like what's, you know, if it's not going your way in a conversation, maybe with the project, like how you approach it?
Yeah, you know, if you approach it early enough, right? So you have a 10-hour task and you're about, you know, let's say the developer is 2 or 3 hours into it and realizes this is a lot more complicated than we thought. We need to recalibrate, you know, that's when you're going to have the most credibility, and you can be matter of fact. Hey, this is going to require we're going to recalibrate the estimate. We think it's going to require another 5 hours. We'll eat the 3 hours if you don't want to do it anymore, right? But it is what it is. You know, we're not going to, you know, do this at a, you know, and pay for it all. But the earlier you do it, the more credibility you have. In most cases, if you do that and say, hey, we just got into this, we realize there's a lot more complexity here. Here's a few more questions for you, points of clarity, you know, help us out here. Another thing to do is offer those alternatives, right? You know, offer to simplify it, offer to maybe divide it up. But I'm always happy to discuss any specific cases with anybody if you encounter that and want to you know, need help addressing that with a client.
Thank you.
I think that, you know, when you're in a position of strength or you know, and you can be matter of fact, you know, it is what it is, right? And many of our clients are reasonable. There are the ones that are not, you know, and Graham, I know you're working with Novo, and he's not the most reasonable. But you know, it is what it is. I think with Novo, we're now past any warranty work. You know, we know him as a client. To Adam's point, we need to make sure we're not underestimating anything. And if you are buffering your estimates, make sure the developers know that. Make sure that, hey, you estimated this at 3 hours. I put it as 5. I expect you to finish it in 3, but I just want to ensure that, you know, we get this right, because the client's going to fight us for every additional hour that we need.
Gotcha. So buffering in that, like, sorry, I'm just trying to formulate the question, but like buffering for clients, like how do we approach that? Is that client to client? We just make it like maybe this client needs a little bit more time to make sure and understand that, like when we estimate the tasks.
Well, think about your interactions with people like Hoveround. Okay, so if with Hoveround, I always tend to find that he's very strict on his hours, and it like even to the point where he disagrees with 5 minutes of deployment time. He disagrees with 10 minutes of investigation. I have to explicitly tell him these are each step. I do not even try to skip steps on anything that's there. And there's more than just buffering on a client by client basis. It's also because of complexity. I would imagine that a NICE adds 30 to 50% to every single one of her tasks for performance health that would be compared to anything else that like we would do on a regular environment, just because of the complexity and the overall architecture of performance health, because you have to. There's just not enough time to do the things in the same amount of time you would do on something very simple versus something very complex like that. So you don't tell them that there's buffering. In fact, they don't know that there is buffering, right? There's never going to be a case where they're going to say, well, how long would it take you for another client? I mean, you would just, I mean, if they ask that question, essentially you're just telling them exactly the amount of time that you estimated for their their instance or whatever. But you have to be the source of authority. I think David's point is what he's saying about from a matter of fact is also confidence is extremely important in this situation. It's why we do our certifications. It's why we do, we don't put us in front of clients until we know what we're talking about. If you go in here and say, well, I think it might be 2 hours, but it could be 5 hours. And I don't know, I'm not sure. They're immediately going to sniff it out and they're going to call you out on it.
Okay.
And they're gonna take you, but at the same time with buffering, it's a slippery slope. You have to be careful about it. In that case, whoever is estimating your tasks for that client has to be aware of it before they're estimating them. And at the same time, you need to be very clear with those developers that, hey, we estimated this at 6 hours, but it really should only take you about 4. We're just putting this here in case you run into issues. But don't put that on the smart sheets. That type of communication has to be happening internally. It's more for protection of the employee than anything for the developers, because we don't want them getting into a situation where they're going to run out of time and then the customer is going to be so strict that they basically crack down on their hours, and then people are losing bonus time, or they're getting under 40 because of it. And it's happened regularly with other customers. So it's important that we protect them by giving that information ahead of time.
Yeah.
And
It's
if I can
very-
add to that, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Bobby.
I had also just, it's very common, especially on front-end scoping for tasks that are integrations and third party. Those are things that we have limited knowledge on. We're either relying on information from the third party or even like, you know, in extension installations. Since those, you know, since we're going into something that we are unaware of, whether it's timeline and budget, you know, it's important to call that out as risk time. So no, it's not, you know, so as far as the buffer goes, you know, I always kind of call it risk time, that there is potential for that because we don't know what we don't know. And it's very important to call it out, not only from a budget perspective, but also from a timeline perspective, that, you know, because these integrations or anything related to a third party adds risk to budget and timeline. So I just feel that it's important that we always call that out and make the client aware of it, that we're giving you our best, you know, our best scope and budget estimate based on the information that we have, but there's always potential risk there.
Yeah, that's a good point. When you're dealing with third parties, you know, when I talk about the plan and strategy, when you're dealing with third parties, I'll tell the client, hey, Folio 3 is doing the integration. We're there to provide some guidance, support, troubleshooting, and validation. And we've allocated, let's say, 15 hours to do that for them. It's very easy to track how much interaction, how many meetings, how much time that we've spent supporting them. Maybe we had our own integration development tasks as well, but we should tell the client, hey, a small part of this is designed to provide guidance, support, and validation of the integration solution. We're not doing it. The third party they're responsible for the bulk of it, but we're providing that role to, you know, and this many hours. And once you've logged more hours than was allocated to that, then you tell them, hey, we have had to interact with Folio 3. I'm using an example from one of Patty's projects. We've had to integrate or interact with them a lot more than we expected, right? You know, we told you up front that, you know, we had 15 hours allocated to that, and they have needed much more of our help than we ever could have anticipated. So it makes it easy to break that down and say, hey, as long as they continue needing our help, we're going to continue racking up the hours there to support them, because, you know, ultimately we're in a guidance, support, validation capacity. That's our role. They're doing most of the development. So excellent points. You know, it's being matter of fact, being, you know, it is what it is, and diplomatic at the same time is hard. And I've met a few people that are really good at it, and their clients actually respect them for it in the end. They might not be happy with every, you know, every decision or every, you know, case of that. But Ian is one of those people that's just very matter of fact. These are the facts. You know, it is what it is. You know, you don't have to like it, but this is the way it is. And ultimately, you know, his clients respect him when he has to kind of pass along the bad news. So it's hard to do, and hard to do diplomatically. Don't get defensive. You know, ultimately it's part of the project, and the best thing you can do is start managing change early. If you set the expectation that it's going to be managed and that you're paying attention, you're watching the dials. They will decide not to do things. They will decide to do things, and they'll bite the bullet and sign the change request. But if you don't manage it, and then all of a sudden at the end of the project, you're trying to recover hours, that's when you get into trouble. Anything else? Patty, do you have anything to add? You do a good job at this.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I've had a couple of different, I think I've had all of those situations in the past, like just 3 months. So the one store that just won't budge, you know, I send them repeated lists of all the decisions I'm waiting on every week. I ask them about the decisions I'm waiting on. And then just remind them that 15 weeks ago, we started this and we're still in discovery. And then with Scientific Sales, I mean, they went grossly over budget because when we launched, there were just so many things that because the customers through Punchout couldn't test through their Ariba, Coupas, you know, their ERPs. There were just so many hot fixes that we had to do on the fly, and a lot of design changes and tweaks that were from the, you know, deviation from the original mock-ups that had been approved. But at that point, he just didn't care. He just wanted it to look better. But yeah, it was more part of like, I'll do what you want me to do. But just know that it's going to increase the cost and we'll get it done.
Yeah.
And that's what these clients have really been, my clients have really been wanting, is just, yeah, let's get it done.
Yeah. And ultimately what the clients want, that's exactly, they want to know when is it going to be done and what is it going to cost. And if you can give that to them, and especially as the project is winding down, if you can give them the confidence that we're going to get this done, this is what it's going to take, here's the final change request to get it done, and be confident in that. You know, in most cases, they have that 20% contingency that they kind of expected they were going to need. But yeah, I hope this helps. I'll post this on the share. It's actually already on the SharePoint site, and I'll post the video as well for when we hire new project managers. But these are topics that we'll continue to dive a little deeper into over time. We could do a training on project status reports and change requests. Yeah, hope this was helpful. Think about this, pull this up when you're working on a project, especially, you know, when you're considering some of those strategic, or more importantly, the tactical best practices. But just catch yourself if you find yourself making any of these mistakes, right? Because you don't want to find yourself in a nightmare scenario at the end of a project. Okay, I think that's about it. We went just a little bit over, but hopefully this adds some value and will pay dividends going forward. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Bye.
Bye.